For tonight's Conversations with Great Minds, I'm joined by award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, and internationally best-selling author, Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein is a contributing editor for Harper's and a reporter for Rolling Stone, writes a regular column for The Nation and The Guardian, but is also syndicated internationally. Her writing has appeared in dozens of other major newspapers, including The New York Times, The Washington Post, Newsweek, and The Los Angeles Times. In 2004, her reporting from Iraq for Harper's Magazine earned her the James Aronson Award for Social Justice Journalism. She is a former Miliband Fellow at the London School of Economics and holds an honorary doctorate of civil laws from the University of King's College in Canada. In 2007, her book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, became a #1 international bestseller. It has now been published in 30 languages with over 1 million copies in print. Her first book, No Logo, Taking Aim at the Brand Bullies, was published in 1999 and was also an international bestseller. The New York Times called it a movement Bible. Time magazine named it as one of the top 100 nonfiction books published since 1923, and the Literary Review of Canada has named it as one of the 100 most important Canadian books ever published. I'm very pleased to welcome Naomi Klein to our New York City studio and this edition of Conversations with Great Minds. Naomi, welcome.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. You've said that the image that ultimately caused you to join the Occupy Wall Street movement protest was a photograph of a young woman holding up a handmade sign that said, "I care about you." You called this a radical act. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I found it very moving. There was actually another sign that was part of the same photo essay that I was looking at, of somebody else holding up a sign that said compassion is a radical act, and I was really moved by it, in large part because I'm increasingly convinced that all of the change that we want, and we talk about, what are your demands, and it might be universal health care, or it might be free public education, that none of this is going to happen unless we really shift the underlying values of our culture, and particularly American culture. And the idea that these young people would be holding up signs that say, "I care about you," on Wall Street. It is such a radical act because you think about what this culture teaches us to do, and it really is to not care about each other, to harden our hearts to each other, to not look at the homeless on the street, or at the extreme end to shout "let them die" at a Republican presidential debate when a question is raised about what to do about somebody who hasn't purchased health care insurance. So these are the types of values that govern this culture, that make the sorts of excesses that people are protesting possible. So that's why I was so moved by that sign of just somebody holding up a sign that said, "I care about you." And as I talk to people at the protest camp at the Occupy Wall Street at Liberty Plaza, I often hear stories about what's drawing people there, why are they there, and they talk about people coming up to them on the street. And I met a young woman who told a story about how a man came up to her on the street and said, "I love you," and she was completely taken aback by this, but then she just realized, well, maybe that's not so bad, so she told him she loved him too. That's the kind of thing happening in New York right now. It's a very odd moment.
Do you think it might be I suspect this is something probably Canadians are far more aware of than Americans, because the Indigenous rights movement in Canada has been so well established over at least the last few decades, and so well publicized, with the change of the Northwest Territories and all that other thing, and the idea of decisions being made in a circle by consensus by an actual governmental body, which doesn't exist anywhere in the United States but does in a province in Canada. And we're seeing that kind of thing, and almost a potlatch culture morality out of it, which again I think most Americans are unfamiliar with, and most Canadians probably are, happening.
Yeah. I don't know if most Canadians are. I mean, I don't think most Canadians are familiar with this kind of gift economy that you see down there.
Yeah.
And that is so radical, the idea of just freely giving each other health care, freely feeding one another, and nothing is asked in return. And that is, if you think about this generation of young people who have grown up at the absolute peak of consumerism, and everything is about consumption and buying and selling. And people are just in love with the idea of a space that is decommodified. But yeah, I think there is a difference in Canada, and this is where it's sort of like, how do you change the values of a culture? It's tricky because, in Canada we do have public health care, we do have universal health care, and I've always felt that changes the character of our country. The fact that we don't have to, as Canadians, develop a rationale for why we let people die if they don't have the money to pay for their health care. That makes us, I think, somewhat of a more compassionate people in some way. So it's tricky because when you bring in when you bring in policies that universalize education, that universalize healthcare, people change, their values change as well. So maybe that's how you do change the values of a culture.
I think you've nailed it. In shock doctrine, you talk about disaster capitalism, how capitalists seize on disasters to reinvent institutions and the world to their favor. And I'm curious, this is kind of a two-part question here for you. First, we just saw a bank nationalized by France and Belgium. This whole mess that's happening in Europe. I'm curious your thoughts on that. But also, and this may even segue out of that, at least for Europe and hopefully here. Doesn't history also show the reverse, that, for example, FDR seized on the disaster of the Republican Great Depression to create a strong social safety net and guarantee the right to unionize? And if so, might this crisis equally backfire on the disaster capitalists?
It could well. And in the shock doctrine, I am very clear about the fact that what is wrong with this tactic as practiced by right-wing ideologues is not that they respond decisively to a disaster with profound policy changes, because of course a crisis is usually some kind of a message. I mean, there are some crises that are just like an earthquake and it doesn't mean anything, it just happened, although a society might be more vulnerable to the effects of that earthquake if they've neglected the public sphere. But if you're talking about an economic crisis, or you're talking about disasters linked to climate change, these disasters, these crises are telling us there's something broken in the system. You should fix it. You should respond. What is sinister about what I describe in the shock doctrine is using crises to push through policies that the vast majority of people oppose, often policies that are the exact opposite of what people voted for, and just using the chaos and the panic to push through these measures under the guise of sort of emergency measures. But what's interesting about the tactic is exactly what you say, Tom, that really what we've seen is a strategy develop on the right in response to the understanding that if you don't have this right-wing shock doctrine strategy, particularly an economic crisis, will be an opportunity for progressives. And of course, the case in point is the New Deal. This was studied very closely. And if we understand what the phase of capitalism that we've been living through, of deregulated privatization, what is often called neoliberalism, this whole phase of capitalism is a revolt of the elites against the gains of the New Deal. To undoing those gains. So a huge amount of study has gone into trying to figure out how to prevent a repeat of that. And that's why you have all of these think tanks that are ready and waiting with their policies, no matter what the crisis is, to push it through. And so this economic crisis, despite the fact that it was created by deregulated capitalism, the solution that ends up getting proposed to pay the bill for this crisis is more deregulation, more tax cuts for the rich. It makes absolutely no sense. That's the shock doctrine. That's disaster capitalism. What's happening on the streets of New York and in cities around the world is people demanding what they actually voted for, and demanding a firm response to real crises that actually gets at the underlying issues that caused the crisis. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Not only is there nothing wrong with it, we desperately need it.
Well, and speaking to what people voted for here in the United States in 2008, President Obama, one of the speeches he gave just 4 days before his election was, you stand with me and I will fundamentally change America and we will fundamentally change the world. That's a revolutionary call. It's not the kind of call that you would expect to hear from a Republican running or even a Democrat in times of stability. Well,
I mean, people often forget that the core debate, right, the real standoff, turning point in the 2008 election was when McCain said the fundamentals of the economy are strong, right? And Obama said, no, they're not. So, of course, as you say, he was elected to implement fundamental change. And he didn't, and that's why people have taken to the streets and gone to the locations, the symbols of financial power that people understand has been the blockade to that kind of change.
Thoughts on where he may be going or where the American political process may be going as a consequence of this, shall we call it charitably, a missed opportunity?
Well, I think, where it's gone is into the streets, and this to me is a tremendous source of hope, because my fear about the Obama presidency, one of my greatest fears about the Obama presidency was that the young people who really were the heart and soul of his campaign in 2008, who knocked on doors and slept on floors, and who got into politics for the first time because they were inspired by the type of rhetoric that you were just quoting, and they believed that this was going to be fundamental change. And of course, one of the issues that most energized young people was climate change, because this is their future. And then when nothing happened in so many areas, and particularly in environmental regulation, but also in job creation and student indebtedness and the ability to afford education, and so what I was afraid of is that this generation would just go back, to their homes and decide that politics is just for losers and disengage, because of course there have been many generations of young people who've disengaged from politics in this country. And that's what's so hopeful about this moment, is that rather than disengaging and lapsing into cynicism or nihilism, you have a generation that's learning from their experience and going, okay, we see that the system has some fundamental flaws. Even if the president isn't interested in fixing those flaws, we're going to get to work fixing them. And so you have all kinds of debates about what are the structural problems. Money in politics, the fact that corporations are treated as persons under the law. These are the types of debates that are happening down at Occupy Wall Street. And I think we're going to start to see some very radical demands come out of this movement. It just takes a while to have a democratic process that can articulate those demands. But I don't think that, some people have talked about how this is sort of, a left-wing Tea Party, or that they're just going to be kind of the sort of street heat for the Washington policy wonks who have ideas for how to tinker with the system. I don't think that this wave of demonstrations and outrage is going to be satisfied with only being that. I think that they're going to want to articulate their vision for a better world, and I hope they do, because they deserve that.
It certainly seems that they are. We'll be back with more of our conversation with Naomi Klein in just a moment.